in the backwoods of southern Appalachia, where the mountains fold in on themselves and the roads vanish into endless pine. There once stood a farmhouse that locals only spoke of in fearful whispers. The Price Place, they called it. Not a home, not even a ruin, just a scar left on the land. The farm itself burned down sometime in the late 1940s, but for decades afterward, people swore that the smell of smoke and rotting flesh still clung to the hollow where it once stood. What the townsfolk found inside that farmhouse, when it finally gave way to fire and collapse, would forever brand the Price name as a story. Parents told to keep their children from wandering too far from home. Jars filled with unrecognizable remains lined the basement shelves. Bones were stacked like firewood, some carved with symbols no one in the county could explain, and in the center of the cellar, half buried in the dirt floor, was what looked like an altar made entirely of human skulls. The Prices weren't just another inbred Appalachian family scraping by in isolation. No, they were something else, something corrupted, diseased, and obsessed with a grotesque faith that demanded more than simple survival. Generations of the Price bloodline had fed on their own kin, not because they were starving, but because they believed it purified them. To them, flesh wasn't food. Flesh was sacrament. The story begins in the mid-1800s, when the first whispers of the Prices spread through the nearby mountain towns. Farmers complained of livestock going missing, sometimes entire herds. Hunters swore they found traps baited, not with meat, but with human bones, bleached and wired together. Then came the disappearances, first travelers, then neighbors, then entire families who had the misfortune of living too close to Price land. And every time, suspicion led back to that rotting farmhouse, with its shuttered windows, and its air of sickness that clung even to the fence posts. But the most disturbing part wasn't the vanishes, it was what happened to the people who came back. A handful of survivors, over the years lost children, escaped travelers. Even a deputy once staggered out of the woods, days or weeks later, gaunt and sickly. They spoke of being forced to eat things they couldn't describe, of rituals carried out in a foul-smelling basement, of the Prices chanting prayers in a language that wasn't English. Their skin carried strange lesions, their eyes looked yellowed, and within months, most of them were dead. Locals called it the Price sickness, though no doctor ever put a name to it. What the Prices did to their captives wasn't about hunger. It was about corruption, about passing on some diseased form of communion. One old preacher claimed the Prices had made a covenant with the devil himself, that their inbreeding and cannibalism were part of a ritual to keep their bloodline pure. But pure didn't mean clean. It meant controlled, rotten, diseased. By the early 1900s, even the law had given up on them. Deputies who went to investigate never returned, or came back feverish and half-mad. There are records of at least 2 raids, both abandoned after the men became violently ill within days. Whatever was festering in that hollow disease curse, or both, it spread quickly, and the Prices seemed to revel in it. The most terrifying account comes from 1923, when a schoolteacher named Martha Collins disappeared while traveling between towns. Weeks later, her body was never found, but her journal turned up at the edge of the Price property, water-damaged and torn. In it, she described hearing voices at night, children crying, men singing, women whispering prayers through the trees. She wrote of seeing figures watching her from the tree line, their faces pale and blistered, their mouths smeared with blood. The final entry is just a single line, scrawled in uneven letters. They want me to join the feast. When the farmhouse finally burned in the late 1940s, some believed the terror of the Price family had ended, but others whispered that the fire wasn't an accident, that the Prices burned their own home down to cover something far worse. Neighbors reported seeing figures running into the woods as the flames spread, carrying jars and bundles wrapped in cloth. No bodies were ever recovered from the ashes. To this day, no one knows how many of them escaped that night. But the sickness lingered, Hikers still vanish in that part of Appalachia, and hunters sometimes stumble upon grisly evidence arranged in ritualistic patterns, jars of preserved organs buried beneath tree roots, strange symbols carved into bark. Locals say those are the marks of the Prices, still carrying out their rituals in the deep woods, long after their farmhouse was reduced to cinders. And if you ask the old folks around those hills, they'll tell you, the worst thing isn't seeing a Price, it's feeling the sickness they leave behind, that creeping fever that settles in your bones, the nightmares that follow, and the gnawing hunger you can't explain. That's the true terror of the Price family. They don't just take your flesh, they corrupt you from the inside out. When the farmhouse burned and the Price name slipped from official records, most people assumed the nightmare had ended. But the truth is, the fire was not the end, it was the beginning of something far worse. The Prices didn't die in those flames, they scattered. And when corruption spreads, it spreads quietly. For decades, strange illnesses plagued the valleys around Price Hollow. Families would fall sick with no warning, lesions spreading across their arms, fevers that no medicine touched, eyes that turned jaundiced and milky. The doctors blamed contaminated water or bad food, but the locals, those who remembered the Prices, whispered otherwise. They claimed the Prices had carried their sickness into the woods, burying it deep in caves and cellars, only to let it seep back out like smoke from a dying fire. Stories began surfacing of travelers who stumbled across crude camps in the forest, half-buried shacks, piles of bones, and animal hides stretched across crude wooden frames. But the bones, they weren't all animal. Some bore the unmistakable marks of butchery, clean cuts through marrow, teeth marks etched into softened edges. A hunter in the 1960s described finding what he thought was a hog's skull nailed to a tree. When he looked closer, he realized it was human. The teeth had been filed down, sharpened 2 points, and then came the rituals. By the 1970s, church elders in the nearby towns began collecting reports of desecrated cemeteries. Graves would be dug up, coffins shattered, bodies missing. The only evidence left behind was ash, circles and symbols carved into the earth. One sheriff who investigated swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the graveyard, pale and blistered, watching him silently before vanishing into the dark. He resigned a week later and never spoke of it again. The Prices weren't just feeding. They were practicing something older, something they believed was sacred. Witness accounts describe rituals where the family would gather in circles, chanting in that same guttural language no outsider recognized. Victims sometimes kidnapped travelers, sometimes their own children were bound to crude wooden frames. Blood was drained, collected into clay bowls, and smeared across the mouths of the family. The flesh wasn't roasted or cooked. It was consumed raw, as if cooking it would diminish its power. A handful of survivors tell the same story. They weren't simply eaten, they were forced to take part. One man, who escaped in 1982, claimed he was made to consume a piece of flesh while the Prices chanted around him. Within days, he grew sick. His skin erupted in boils, his breath reeked of decay, and he could no longer keep food down. Before his death, he swore he felt something crawling inside him, whispering at the edge of his mind. His family burned his body in fear that the sickness would spread. And yet, the Prices lived on, hidden in the mountains, moving from one shack to another, always staying ahead of curious eyes. Locals reported hearing their chants in the dead of night, carried across the valleys like smoke. Hunters claimed to see pale figures watching from tree lines, their bodies too thin, their mouths too wide, their skin marred with sores. The most chilling detail, though, is that the Prices no longer looked entirely human. Generations of inbreeding, disease, and ritual cannibalism had warped them into something other. Eyewitnesses describe elongated limbs, crooked spines, and mouths lined with jagged teeth. Some said their skin glowed faintly under the moon, covered in oozing sores that never healed. To see a price was to see the very embodiment of corruption. But the question remains, what were they worshipping? Some claim the prices believed in an old Appalachian legend, the rotting father, a spirit of decay said to live in the soil itself. According to folklore, he whispered promises of immortality to those who would consume the flesh of their kin. Others believed the prices weren't following folklore at all, but something darker and ancient sickness that twisted the human body into a vessel for its spread. Whatever the truth, the price rituals didn't die in the 1800s or the 1940s. They evolved. In the 1990s, hikers found a clearing deep in the mountains, with a circle of bones laid out in precise geometric patterns. At the center was a wooden cross, not upright, but inverted, smeared with blood. Buried beneath it were dozens of glass jars, each filled with preserved organs, floating in brine. Scientists, who later tested the jars, confirmed that at least half contained human tissue. Even today, campers vanish without a trace in those woods. Locals swear the prices are still out there, carrying on their rituals, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close. And when you do, they say you don't just die. Your consumed body and soul, your sickness becoming theirs, your flesh turned into sacrament. The fire didn't end the prices, it freed them. And the terror they spread across Appalachia didn't fade it, only festered, growing darker and more corrupt with every passing generation. By the time the 21st century rolled in, most people assumed the Price family was just a folk tale, a campfire ghost story about sickness, cannibalism, and the dangers of straying too far into the hollow. But then came the disappearances, and the evidence. In 2003, a group of college students camping near an abandoned coal trail reported hearing voices outside their tents. At first, they assumed it was other campers, but when the voices drew closer, they realized they weren't words at all. It was chanting, guttural and wet, like mouths filled with liquid. One of the students swore he saw pale figures crouching at the tree line, their eyes reflecting the firelight. They packed up in a frenzy and fled. 2 weeks later, one of the group was found dead in her apartment, hundreds of miles away, 'cause of death, severe infection. Her body was covered in sores, identical to the lesions described in old Price family reports, and that wasn't the last. Park rangers began filing strange incident reports. Mutilated deer carcasses left arranged in ritualistic patterns, jars of preserved organs buried shallow in the dirt, and crude wooden effigies hung from tree branches. When the state police tried to investigate, they hit a wall of silence. Files went missing. Rangers were reassigned. Witnesses retracted their statements. It was as if someone wanted the prices to stay hidden. But the most chilling evidence comes from what locals call the price tapes. In 2011, a pair of urban explorers stumbled into the ruins of a farmhouse in the hollow. In the basement, beneath layers of rotting boards, they discovered a rusted trunk filled with cassette tapes. When played, the recordings were disturbing beyond belief. Hours of chanting, screams that sounded neither fully human nor animal, and a wet tearing noise that could only be described as feeding. In the background, a man's voice repeated phrases over and over in a language no one recognized. Authorities dismissed the tapes as a hoax, but locals swear they were genuine, and that those explorers vanished within weeks of uploading their discovery. Their bodies were never found. The real question is, how have the Prices survived this long? Generations of inbreeding, corruption, and sickness should have wiped them out. And yet, sightings persist. Witnesses describe groups of thin, pale figures, moving silently through the woods, their bodies disfigured but agile, their eyes glowing faintly, as if reflecting a fire no one else could see. Some claim the Prices have adapted learning to lure victims using recordings of human voices. Hikers report hearing their own names whispered in the trees, even when no one else is with them. There are also whispers of government knowledge. A declassified report from the 1970s mentions a biological contamination vector in the Appalachian region, linked to uncontrolled familial groups. Though the report never uses the name price, the descriptions match perfectly. It speaks of anomalous resilience in carriers, ritualistic consumption, and psychological disturbances transmitted through auditory exposure. In other words, the prices weren't just surviving, they were spreading. Perhaps. The most disturbing case surfaced in 2019. A family driving through a back road in the hollow broke down near dusk. While waiting for help, they noticed movement in the cornfields. Dozens of figures, half naked and blistered, watching silently. The father reported hearing whispers at the edge of the field, begging him to come closer. When he refused, the figures began moving jerky, insect-like, unnaturally fast. The family abandoned the car and ran. They were found the next morning, barefoot and hysterical, their clothes shredded as if by claws. Their abandoned car never recovered. What does this mean for us today? Some folklorists argue the prices are extinct, their bloodline finally rotted away. But others believe they've evolved into something else, no longer entirely human, no longer entirely bound to the hollow. They may carry their corruption beyond Appalachia, following highways, infecting towns, spreading their sickness like spores. And if the whispers are true, the prices don't just consume flesh anymore. They consume voices, memories, and identity itself. Survivors claim that after hearing the prices chant, they began dreaming in a language they'd never learned. Some even reported hearing the voices of their own loved ones, urging them into the woods. The corruption is no longer physical, it's spiritual. The terrifying truth is that the forgotten terror of the Price family may not be forgotten at all. Their rituals still echo in the mountains. Their sickness still festers in the soil, and if you're unlucky enough to walk those woods at night, you may find that the Prices are not only waiting for you. They've been calling your name all along. Asterisk if you thought the Price family's corruption ended in the hollow, think again. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes that their sickness is not just a legend, it's something that could still be spreading today. And if those tapes are real, then their voices may already be out there, waiting for someone like you to listen. So tell me in the comments, do you believe the Price bloodline died with the flames? Or are they still out there, lurking in the shadows, calling out to anyone foolish enough to wander too close? Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story takes us even further into Appalachia, where another family's horrors make even the Prices seem tame. You won't want to miss what's coming. Until then, keep your lights on, and whatever you do, never answer when the woods whisper your name.